Our first story here is about Nathan Hale and Benjamin Tallmadge. Tallmadge was born in Setauket in 1854, and Nathan Hale was born in Connecticut in 1855. So they were about a year apart in age. And Benjamin Tallmadge's father, which was also named Benjamin Tallmadge, was the minister of the Setauket Presbyterian Church. And that's when they moved to Setauket, the family. And his father went to Yale, and Benjamin always figured his son would go to Yale, Benjamin, and he did. Very intelligent kid. He was homeschooled for the most part. The rest of the people who were in Setauket that were part of the spy ring went to a one-room schoolhouse. We don't know whether Benjamin actually went to that one-room schoolhouse or not, but he was mostly homeschooled by his father, especially in the Romance languages, in Greek, in Latin, in science, mathematics, and the other disciplines. So he was prepared to go to Yale by the time he was 12 or 13 years old. His father said, the principal, in fact, or headmaster of Yale, said he's welcome to come. His father said, let's wait a couple of years. So he ended up going in 1869, the graduating class of 1873. Nathan Hale was younger, a year younger than Tallmadge, but his brother Enoch was a little older. And so his father said, well, Enoch, I'm going to make you wait a year and go to Yale with your brother. I want the two of you. New Haven was the big city. And going from a rural farm in Connecticut to the big city was an experience, and his father wanted the two boys to sort of help each other out. So Enoch waited a year, and they both went down to New Haven, to Yale, and Tallmadge and the two Hale brothers became close friends. And they were a little bit mischievous at Yale. Well, 15, 14, 16 years of age, they're not exactly typical college students from today, although the typical college students from today are not much different. They were, one evening, after a little bit of drinking, and there was no restrictions on it the way it is today, they went around the campus breaking windows. And that got them in a little bit of trouble. Only a little bit, because these were three very, very good students. Nathan was definitely the better of the two, Nathan and Tallmadge. Tallmadge was more easygoing, but Hale was better looking. So Hale got the girls, whereas Tallmadge had to work at it a bit. He's kind of baby-faced kid. But they really enjoyed each other, and they received, along with their 34 other classmates, 33, excuse me, it's three of them. The graduating class of 1773 was 36. And they were the largest class in Yale at the time. And As you know, the Revolutionary War started in 1775. When they graduated in 73, Tallmadge graduated in the spring, and Enoch and Nathan graduated in the fall. And so for that time that Tallmadge was a teacher and school administrator in Wethersfield, Connecticut, they wrote letters back and forth to each other. And they labeled them Damon and Pythias, which are the two characters from Greek mythology, and they also interested in Shakespeare. This graduating class of 36 were very studious. They knew a lot about the world. They knew a lot about language. They knew a lot about people around the world. These were students who were very interested in what was going on in the world. The majority of them, I think 35 out of the 36, were officers in the American Revolution. Now, when you think of the American Revolution, what do you think of? George Washington? You think of Benedict Arnold? You think of Henry Knox? You think of Nathaniel Greene and all the generals, right? That's what you think about? But these were all of the soldiers and the officers. These were the guys who actually did all the work of the Revolutionary War. These were the ones who had the men, 20, 30, 40 men that they were responsible for. So they were what actually made the Revolutionary War work. Because the graduating classes of Yale and Harvard as well, from 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, became the cadre of officers for the Revolutionary War. And they were the ones who basically made it work. And the letters going back and forth between Tallmadge and Nathan Hale were some of the documents that really tell the story about what was going on. I want to read you some of that. This is Benjamin Tallmadge to Nathan Hale, May 9th, 1775. America, my friend, at the present period, sees such times as she never saw before. The great wheels of the state and constitution seem to have grown old and crazy. Everything bids fair for a change. How soon a great, flourishing, and powerful state may arise from that now stigmatized by the name of rebel, God only knows. The prospect, however, for the same seems to be great, but that we ought at present to desire it is far from being clear. We ought by all means to prepare for the worst, and then we may encounter danger with more firmness and with better prospects of success. This is a man born, he is now 21 years old. Most of the members of the Continental Congress were older, but they all had the same attitude toward what was going on and what needed to be done. They both became school teachers, or actually all three of them became school teachers in Connecticut in 73. And then in 75, both Tallmadge and Enoch joined up and became soldiers. And wrote letters back and forth about what it was important to do and how they would do it and go into the army. Nathan Hale, in April of 1775, was teaching school in a small town that's now East Haddam, Connecticut, and it was called Modus at the time. And he said he was the primary teacher in this school, and so he became the primary spokesman when the town got together to decide what they were going to do to support the war effort. And he stood up and he said, "Let us march immediately and never lay down our arms until we obtain our independence." And this is April 22nd, 1775. And this is from a 20-year-old. The interesting thing about that is the word independence. Now, you all think of the word independence as being something that is part of our history going way back, right? But yet it's a word that basically didn't occur in the English language until about 1630 or 1640. And it was used to describe the extreme Puritans that came over into this area. And the entire town rallied around Nathan Hale. He didn't leave right away. He had to finish school. He had to write a letter to the principal and do all that kind of thing. But he was set to go. June 15th, same year, 1775, General George Washington became the leader of the Continental Army. He was appointed commander-in-chief by Congress. July 4th, 1775, Benjamin Tallmadge writes a letter to Nathan Hale. And he said, "You must," in this part of what he said, "you must already be considered as acting in a public capacity and in a sphere which no one can say is demeaning to the public." School teacher. Tallmadge's main point, however, was more serious. He goes on to say, "When I consider our country a land flowing, as it were, with milk and honey, holding open her arms and demanding assistance from all who can assist in her sore distress, methinks a Christian's counsel must favor the latter." In other words, give up teaching, join the army, and go on from there. 3 days later, Nathan Hale joined the army and says in one of his letters back to Tallmadge, "The year for which I engaged will expire within a fortnight, so that my quitting a few days sooner, I hope, will subject you to no great inconvenience." I'm sorry, not to Tallmadge, to the principal of the school. Then in the summer of 1775, as he's getting ready to leave, one of his things he says to his father in a letter is, "A sense of duty urges me to sacrifice everything for my country." So we know where he's headed, right? Immortality. He joins the army and he's assigned to Brooklyn, New York, after Washington moves from Boston down to New York. Tallmadge is with his troop, and so is Nathan Hale with his. And Nathan is itching to do something realistic. He's got his men. He's trying to keep them fed. He's trying to keep them clothed. He's trying to keep them busy. He's trying to train them in being a good soldier. And he's learning himself at the same time. So he's in New York, and they're along the shore, and they see this gigantic British warship called the Asia, one of the largest ships there. And right next to it is a sloop, one-masted sailboat. It's about 60 feet long, and it has an incredible amount of supplies on it. Food, ammunition, guns, all kinds of stuff. So rather than say to his boss, I want to take some of my troops and go out and try to capture this sloop, which was kind of foolhardy, he decides to do it without telling his commander. He takes a select group of his men, he goes out, and this is reported by one of his officers later, about a year later, 2 years later, after he's already been hung by the British. And he takes 2 of his men with him, and the rest he keeps on shore. And this is after dark. And they go out in a small boat, and they approach the sloop after he hears them say, all clear, and he knows that the men are going below for the evening. I don't know if there was a guard on board. It doesn't mention it in the information. But he leaves the 2 men on the boat, and they're right under the sloop. Nobody's seen them so far. And he himself climbs up on the sloop, closes the cabin door, locks it, trapping all the men below, and he sails the sloop back to shore with all the supplies. That's the kind of guy he was right from the start. Now, you don't hear that story very often about Nathan Hale, and it's in the book Nathan Hale by William Phillips, one of the newer books on Nathan Hale. Lots of other wonderful stories as well. As you know, Nathan Hale is hung by the British in New York City. I'm not going to tell that story. You've heard it a million times. Tallmadge is very disturbed. It's his best friend. It's his daemon to his Pythias during college. And he also lost his brother during the Battle of Long Island, who was captured and put on a prison ship and died of starvation. Doesn't say how long. But later on, Tallmadge, as you know, becomes head of Washington Secret Service. And he hears the name John Anderson as a man to watch out for. And he goes upstate New York, and he follows the trail of John Anderson, who turns out to be John Andre, the head of the British intelligence. And he then captures Andre on his way back to being taken back to Arnold, who the soldiers who took him back don't understand that Arnold's probably a traitor now. So he captures Andre, and he's with Andre by himself, taking him back to the encampment where he will remain until he's hung. And he writes here, in one instance, later on during the Revolutionary War, General Washington placed Nathan's friend Benjamin Tallmadge in charge of guarding John Andre, a British spy, as he was being prepared for court-martial. Tallmadge found Andre a most pleasant prisoner and had long conversations with him. The ease and affability of his manners, Tallmadge, then a major, said, quote, polished by the refinement of a good society and a finished education, made him a most delightful companion. It almost drew tears from my eye to find him so agreeable in conversation on different subjects when I reflected on his future fate, and that too, as I feared, so near at hand. And yet, as Tallmadge and Andre were riding on a trail side by side one day, Andre asked Tallmadge about what lay in store for him. Tallmadge did all he could to ignore the question. But after Andre pestered him, urging his captor to give him explicit details of what was going to happen, Tallmadge, as written in his autobiography, by the way, this is all from Tallmadge's autobiography, Tallmadge stopped his horse and quite emotionally said, "I had a much-loved classmate in Yale College by the name of Nathan Hale. General Washington wanted information respecting the strength, position, and probable movements of the enemy. Captain Hale tendered his services and was taken." Recalling the conversation with Andre at a later date, Tallmadge explained that he had paused at that specific moment and then, rather abruptly, while staring at Andre in his eyes, snapped, "Do you remember the sequel of the story?" "Yes," said Andre. "He was hanged as a spy." "But you surely do not consider his case and mine alike," Andre said. Because he had been treated so humanely, and many didn't consider Andre an actual undercover agent like Nathan, he obviously didn't see the comparison. That a spy is a spy, no matter what his mission or how or where he is captured. Tallmadge said, "Yes, precisely similar, and similar will be your fate." As Andre sized Tallmadge up, despair washed over his face as he realized, perhaps for the first time since being taken prisoner, that he was going to die. And with that he endeavored, Tallmadge later said, to answer my remarks. But it was manifest he was more troubled in spirit than I had ever seen him before. Question?
No, I'm dumb. No. I guess I think about it from a feelings perspective and how difficult it must have been for Tallmadge knowing what happened to his best friend and then almost admiring this other gentleman now, Andre, yet he is going to be hanged also. Does he talk about that in his memoirs at all? His feelings?
Just what you said there.
That's all?
That's it. And then on to another subject. He also didn't discuss in his autobiography about being a spy, about his spies.
Yeah, we talked about that on some of the tours that I did today. That one of the things we laughed about is if somebody was spying today, they'd probably have their cell phone up, go, "Oh, I'm taking a selfie. Look at me. I'm spying." And it was so not the case. You've also said that spying was something that they felt was not.
It was ungentlemanly.
Yeah, we don't get that.
Yeah.
And so they wouldn't talk about it.
Yeah. In my article this week in the Village Times, I headed the article, 5 Gentlemen and a Lady. The lady, of course, is Anna Smith Strong, described by Woodhull as 355, which is Tallmadge's code. But the Tallmadge code only means lady. And these were gentlemen. And they basically did what they felt needed to be done at the time. But they didn't like it. And basically, Nathan Hale was not Washington's first choice to go to New York and on Long Island be a spy. The guy who wanted to do it said, "Are you joking? You want me to go over there to New York? You want me to get hung? Because that's exactly what's going to happen if I go." He said, "No, I'm not doing it." In the entire Connecticut regiment, the only person to volunteer was Nathan Hale. Blonde, blue-eyed, good-looking, talkative, wrong person to be a spy. Well, let's talk about a loyalist. A man named Benjamin Floyd. And Benjamin Floyd was a cousin of William Floyd. William Floyd was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And was he a loyalist? No. He was a patriot. He signed the Declaration of Independence. But his cousin, Benjamin Floyd, was a loyalist colonel, responsible to the Governor General in New York City, Governor Tryon, who was the head of, not the army, but the head of all of New York during the time the British occupied Long Island and part of New York. Benjamin Floyd's brother was Richard Floyd, the fourth Richard in the line here in Setauket. And he was also a loyalist colonel. And so the family was split.
Do you think that happened a lot, Bev, in terms of the people that were living not just in Setauket, but across Long Island?
Across Long Island, and especially throughout the 13 colonies. In fact, the British came here with the idea that they could win the war if they got the support of the Loyalists, which never happened enough to help them win the war. Anyway, Colonel Benjamin Floyd, he was born in Setauket in 1740. Now, most of the spies were born, the oldest one of the spies was Caleb Brewster, who was born in 1748. Austin Rowe, born in 1749. Abraham Woodall, 1750. Austin Rowe, 1748. And Benjamin Tallmadge, 1754. He was born in 1740. And who else was born in 1740 that worked for the spy ring? Anna Smith Strong. So she was 10 years older than Abraham Woodall. And Benjamin Floyd and Anna Smith Strong were friends, even though they went to different churches. Anna Smith Strong went to the Presbyterian Church, and Benjamin Floyd, even though his family went to the Presbyterian Church, he was an Anglican, loyal to the king, and went to Caroline Church, which some of you may have taken a tour and seen some of the graves over there. Benjamin lived his entire life in Setauket. He had the ancestral home behind the Presbyterian Church down near the water of Setauket Harbor. Then, as he was growing up, getting married, he had a house in Oldfield, and then his brother inherited the house, but his brother went up to Canada after the war, so Benjamin took over the family home after the war. But during the Revolutionary War, Benjamin was town supervisor for the town of Brookhaven. And he was a member of the board of the town before that. And his father before him had been a member of the board. That was the third Richard. And Loyalists, by the time the Revolutionary War started in August of '76, when the British took over Long Island, and a lot of the patriots left and became refugees in Connecticut, I would say between a third and a half of the people who were patriots left. The rest of them stayed here for various reasons. They were farmers and other reasons I won't go into. So when the British took over, the elections of 77, 78, and 79 were all won by Loyalists. So the Loyalists were in charge of town government. and Benjamin was the supervisor of the town and president of the town trustees. Other Loyalists who lived in Setauket include John Bayless, Dr. George Morrison, and the Caroline Anglican Church pastor James Lyon. Benjamin Floyd was married in 1767. He had 4 children between 1768 and 1773. He worked very hard to maintain community during that time period. One of the things that he recognized, and Abraham Woodall also recognized, was the fact that no matter who won, they were going to have to live together after the war. So don't do anything to break up community, because community to many of them was as important, or from the standpoint of Benjamin Floyd, more important than the war. We have a letter written to Benjamin Floyd in January 1776 from Richard Miller, an avowed Loyalist, or as the Patriots would call him, a Tory. Miller writes, "I hope you and all the other good friends to government will keep up good courage until spring, for I hope that we shall have better times and much better liberty than committee liberty." Miller was also asked to be remembered to old Mr. Lyons and John Bayless, both Tories. Unfortunately for him, Miller was captured and executed by men under the command of Patriot Captain Daniel Rowe of Selden before the British took control following the Battle of Long Island. Benjamin Floyd did not have an easy time during the Revolutionary War. He was captured twice and eventually traded back for other prisoners. That was the purpose of capturing somebody who was a colonel. And in 1779, this is a letter from Abraham Woodall to Benjamin Tallmadge. "Night before last, a most horrid robbery was committed on the houses of Colonel Benjamin Floyd and Mr. Seaton by 3 whaleboats from your shore, commanded by Joseph Hultz and Fade Donaldson, and one other master of boat, name unknown. 725 came well informed you of their names. 725 is Caleb Brewster. From the best judgment I can form, they took to the value in money, household goods, and bonds and notes of 3,000 pounds. They left nothing in the house that was portable, and they even took their clocks and all the looking glasses and all of Seaton's gold claws, perhaps none before them in America. I cannot put up with such a wanton waste of property. I know there are enemies to our cause, but yet their property should not go amongst such villains. I beg you would insert yourself and bring them to justice." That's written Tallmadge to George Washington. And then Tallmadge to George Washington writes a letter also about this. This is a report from the Royal Gazette, the New York newspaper, for 3 November. Reported that a party of about 20 rebels in 3 whaleboats arrived near the house of Colonel Benjamin Floyd. They attacked the house and robbed him of 600 pounds and the most valuable part of his household goods. 2 of the party had their faces blackened, and the same night the house of Mr. Andrew Seaton was robbed by the same party of the most valuable part of the effects. In a letter to Washington, from Benjamin Tallmadge. He says to Washington, you got to do something about this. I won't read you the letter. You got to do something about this. I mean, these are the residents of the town. Yes, they're the enemy, but they're the residents of the town. So Washington writes a letter to General Clinton in New York. And he says the same thing. And then Clinton sends a note to the State Assembly on 8 September that drew attention to a congressional resolution urging measures to prevent the plundering of the inhabitants of Long Island and other places in possession of the enemy. Now, the legislature in New York is Patriot, up in Albany. But the letter comes from the British commander in New York. So these guys are communicating back and forth with each other about the realistic way in which you conduct a war. And you don't involve civilians. The New York State Legislature then adopted a resolution on 10 September, quote, that His Excellency the Governor be requested forthwith to issue his proclamation strictly forbidding all persons subject to the state to plunder the inhabitants of Long Island or any other place in possession of the enemy in this or any other of the United States, and thereby declared that if any of them shall so offend against the law of nations and the rights of war, they shall be deemed and treated as pirates and freebooters, which means they be hung. These are the documents during the Revolution, letters, material that we base our stories on. It's important to remember that there's a difference between storytelling using original documents and storytelling a la Hollywood. So just understand that what you read that has good sources, material involved with it, is what you can believe. Any questions? Yes. Is it possible that Benjamin Floyd was an unknown collaborator? No, but Benjamin Floyd was interested in preserving community. He was a good friend of Abraham Woodhull's. Woodhull was asked by Tallmadge through Washington to let Benjamin Floyd know that he was a spy. Woodhull refused, and he wrote a letter back to Tallmadge in Washington saying, I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to put that kind of pressure on a friend of mine. He may have known it and didn't have to say anything, but once he gets it officially, that makes it different. What does he do then as a colonel of the militia, of the British Army? What does he do then? Sometimes it's better not to know. But I'll tell you, at the end of the war, Benjamin Franklin Thompson, historian, one of the first Long Island historians, he mentions the names of the spy ring: Abraham Woodhull, Caleb Brewster, doesn't mention Austin Rowe, but they were all working for Benjamin Tallmadge. He says this in 1836. So they all knew. They didn't talk about it because they were gentlemen, but they knew. Silas Strong and Caleb Brewster on Strong's neck. Now, Tallmadge writes, I came from Long Island this afternoon, but have no dispatches. Culper has been down to New York. I waited until this morning and was sent by them by 2 o'clock, but before he sent them, I was attacked by Glover and Hoyt and left one man taken and one wounded. Caleb Brewster never lost a single battle on Long Island Sound. Not one. I shall want 2 men before I come across again. I have got now boats in fine order and wish you to send me 7 men, and I engage to take some of their boats. Mr. Murison will give you a particular account of our cruise. Mr. Murison is the Dr. Murison, who was a Loyalist, son, who was one of the boat captains for Caleb Brewster. Austin told me that Sir Henry Clinton went down to the east end of the island on the 16th. Don't fail to let me have 2 crews, if you can, of Continental soldiers. With respect, your friend and humble servant, Caleb Brewster. August 20th, Newcastle, 1780. Enclosed is a letter from the person who has for a long time brought dispatches from the Culpers. In other words, Caleb Brewster. Your Excellency will perceive he has been attacked by some of the refugee boats. He requests more men. I am sorry that Brewster was driven from Long Island so suddenly, as dispatches from Culper Jr. were then waiting for him. So it's important to give him more men to do what he needs to do. And then basically he says basically the same thing. And he mentions other people, like a man named Kinner, who was also one of the boat captains for him. Caleb Brewster writes to, basically to George Washington on August 27, 1780. This is part of what he writes. After time, to take some of their officers there out with their hounds every day. A fine time to take some of the officers out with their hounds every day. And I lay up back of Esquire Strong's yesterday, and there came a lieutenant of 17th Regiment, British, within gunshot of us, looking for Squire Strong's hounds afoot. But he begged so hard, I thought it best not to take him. In other words, Squire Strong was looking for his dogs. Caleb Brewster was with him. Brewster was going to shoot this guy. And he says, it is not best to take him, as it was forenight, his house, and they were riding continually from one station to the other. Troops all coming from the east as far as Miller's Place, and Sir Henry Clinton gone to New York, and the British fleet has sailed, and etc., etc. So basically, he was saying, if you shoot this guy, they're going to come and they're going to look through all our houses. They're going to give us a hard time. They're probably going to arrest us, blah, 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 blah. So Silas Strong, who was back in Setauket by June of 1780, convinced Brewster not to shoot this guy. Kate Strong writes later in her True Tales about Nancy's magic clothesline. And in this section she says, while we do not know how she received the messages, in other words, she found out about where Brewster was hiding with his whaleboats, so that Woodhull can go and give him the messages to take across the Sound to Benjamin Tallmadge. Says, while we do not know how she received the messages, we do know that a letter from Caleb Brewster to Washington told that one day he and Silas Strong were walking together and saw a British soldier on the shore below. Caleb wanted to shoot him, but Silas stopped him and told him it would make the place too hot for him if he did. So That's pretty accurate, isn't it? Right on target for the letter. And so that's basically the stories based on the documents that we have and the follow-up with people like the Strongs who tell these stories and afterwards, but based on the letters and the documents that Mrs. Strong has in her possession, most of which ended up in the Three Village Historical Society collection. So hopefully the stories that get told in schools and the stories that get told in print will give you a better idea of what's going on. Any questions? I got you all stumped, huh?